Of Australia's university sector in years is set to be publicly released today. It is expected to lay out a path for the federal government to substantially reform universities over the next decade.
And even before its release, it's been contentious. Professor Andy Marks is Assistant Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney University and CEO of the NUW Alliance and joins us now. Good morning.
Hey, g'day.
To start with, what are the key recommendations that you think are crucial here from this reform package?
This reform's all about equity, Dan. So it's very much focused on the idea that we want to see a thing called population parity in the levels of people that are attending university. That means Indigenous Australians, that means women, that means people who are from low socioeconomic backgrounds, all of them having a fair chance at getting a university degree.
And in fact, the report focused quite significantly on that point, saying that more Australians from underrepresented backgrounds need to go to university and tying it to the skills that the economy needs for the future. So can you just unpack what does that actually mean and why have they focused so squarely on that?
That's the centre of these reforms. It's mainstreaming, if you like, what used to be called equity or I guess marginal activities of universities. It's saying if we want to hit these big targets in qualified people to build the skills for Australia's future, then we have to bring everyone with us. So whereas equity in the past has been something that's more a program of university operations, now government is saying you've got to boost numbers, and this is the group that we want to be first in the queue. It's those equity groups.
And when you talk about the government wanting to boost numbers, that's the commitments or the language that the minister has been using. What's the pathway to do that? Because one of the other elements of the report says that at least 80% of the workforce will need a vet or university qualification by 2050. And right now, I think that's sitting around 60%. So that's quite a big increase. And we're talking in, under 30, 25 years or so.
It's a massive increase. These reforms, if government decides to act on the recommendations, are going to be remembered like the HECS reforms of the 80s or the Whitlam reforms in the early 70s. They are very substantial. So it'll be interesting to watch a government that hasn't really tackled too much by way of big reforms successfully to see whether or not they have the appetite for them. But one hint that they might do is the fact that, as I said, they are tying this to a skills imperative, not just an education, obsession.
And the other side of that, you touched on HECS, is that recommendations around calling for a return to a demand-driven funding model that some are already calling a wealth tax or a whole lot of other different forms of language. Do you think that what role do you think that change would mean for the overall shift that has been called for in the education sector? Look,
there's sort of good and bad elements to HECS. HECS was an incredible reform for opening up university education to a really very large number of Australians in the 80s and 90s. But now you're seeing the impost of the housing crisis. It's incredibly difficult for women too, who take time out of the workforce for raising children, or in the main, that they can't keep up those repayments and clear the decks of their HECS debt. So reforms to HECS that make them fairer. We saw the tail end of the Morrison government bring reforms in too that made some courses more expensive. It's more expensive to do an arts degree, for example, now, much, much more expensive than it has been in times gone by. So these reforms seek to level that out, and they recognise that everyone's experience of education is not the same. But they're incredibly ambitious, and I couldn't say that enough. I think you've seen a lot of tinkering and a lot of failed attempts at reform recently, but these are very, very big reforms.
And just finally, the report called for a staged approach to the recommendations. It certainly wasn't suggesting they all need to be done immediately, but even some costings are that to roll them all out would be billions of dollars. We're talking about an extraordinarily huge political appetite that's going to be required for this. Do you think it's there?
I think it can be there if the argument's made on the broadest of terms. If this is an argument about educational reform, it won't get over the line. And Labor is really positioning this as an argument about skills, about equity, about do we want to be a fair country, about what kind of economy do we want to have? Do we want a knowledge economy, or do we want to keep digging stuff up out of the ground? So if they broaden the argument and get everybody interested, it could get over the line. If they make them just higher education reforms, they won't get there.
Well, a lot more discussion to come. Professor Andy Marks, Assistant Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney University. Thanks so much for your company and insights this morning.
Anytime.